Hey everybody. This video delves into the Rwandan Genocide, which means hate speech and violence, including brutal acts and graphic imagery that will be disturbing. Viewer discretion is so strongly advised, especially for younger or more sensitive audiences. If you're not in a good place, please just come back later. The video's not going anywhere. I'm not kidding. There's going to be some traumatic shit in like 3 seconds. Let's meet this guy, a person that the Red Cross can only identify as Nyabimana. He's more than just a name though. He's a grim lesson in the lethal power of words. He was found wandering near Kigali, Rwanda, and his scars don't just hint at brutality, they scream the horror of a 100-day massacre that annihilated hundreds of thousands of living, breathing human beings. Next year marks the Rwandan Genocide's 30th anniversary, and I'm not just here today as a history YouTuber or a teacher. I'm here to bear witness to the haunting might of words. In a world drowning in hate speech and misinformation, Nyabimana's story forces us to ask, can words kill? Can our beloved free speech put new machetes in new hands, targeting refugees, trans people, Muslims, or who knows what group next? So join me as we look at the Rwandan Genocide and reveal the bone-chilling answer. Alright, let's plunge into the tangled history leading up to the Rwandan Genocide. We're going to dissect how ethnicity, colonial meddling, and politics set the stage for this. I almost hesitate to call it a tragedy. It feels like such a too light of a term. So let's picture Rwanda. It's snug in the heart of Africa, neighbored by Congo, Uganda, Tanzania, and Burundi. Its people primarily hail from 3 groups: the Twa, the original hunter-gatherers, and the agricultural/shepherding Hutu and Tutsi. A Tutsi king had seized control, sowing the seeds of tension between Hutus and Tutsis, even though they shared both a language and culture. But then, unbeknownst to the people of Rwanda, might I add, a group of inbred monsters we today call European aristocrats met up in Berlin and decided that they could dismember the nations of the African continent and sort the spoils out amongst themselves. Rwanda fell into the lap of Germany. The Germans decided to empower the Tutsi elite to impose control over the country without expending too much of their own resources. They also had some weird notion that the Tutsis were from Ethiopia and thus possessed some kind of racial superiority, something that only really Victorians and people with statues of Greek philosophers as their profile pictures would really understand. After Germany had engaged in its favorite 20th century activity, losing world wars, Rwanda was relegated to the worst country in all of history, Belgium. Yes, I know it's a weird thing to say because Belgium is a nonsense country, but they really were horrible tyrants. They had been responsible for the rubber terror in the nearby Congo region, which was one of the worst acts of colonial violence in human history, which is a very high bar to hit. So yeah, get bent, Belgium. Anyways, the Belgians kept much of the German playbook, did much of the same thing, except for one important fact. In the 1930s, Belgians imposed ID cards that labeled everyone in the country as Hutu, Tutsi, or Twa. These categories before had been more porous and fluid, and now became rigid racial castes. After World War II, the second L on the board for Germany, for anyone who's curious, the Hutus had started agitating for a slice of the power pie, and they got endorsements from the Catholic Church. The Tutsis resisted this effort, advocating for independence so that they could secure their grip on power. In 1957, a group of Hutu scholars penned something called the Bahutu Manifesto, the first document that branded Tutsis and Hutus as different races, and called for a Hutu takeover of the country. By 1959, a rumor of a Hutu leader's death had ignited violence across the country, so with Belgian support, the Hutus usurped power, and Rwanda gained independence in 1962, with the Hutus taking over and running the country. Fearing purges and violence, many Tutsis began to flee in huge numbers. By 1964, 300,000 Tutsis had escaped Rwanda to neighboring countries. Now, put a pin in that fact for a second, because it's going to be important just a little bit later. After independence came a line of dictators who were hardly different from the monarchy they just opposed. Tutsis under this regime endured escalating violence and exclusion from many parts of power in society. Meanwhile, Rwanda's population exploded, making it one of Africa's most densely populated regions, which exacerbated competition for land and resources. There it was, a perfect storm. Colonial wreckage, ethnic tension, autocratic rule, and resource scarcity. Many of the pieces for the oncoming genocide. A powder keg primed to explode. First, let's talk about Fred Rwigema. He was the leader of a group called the Rwandan Patriotic Front, which was a rebel group of Tutsi refugees and their descendants fighting in other countries, specifically in Uganda. After battling in Uganda and elevating Yoweri Museveni to power, Fred decided to return and invade Rwanda. During an invasion of his home country, Fred died and a guy named Paul Kagame took over. Kagame rallied his troops after the failed invasion and attacked Rwanda again in 1991, leading to a long, deadly cat-and-mouse game with the Rwandan army. Now, Rwanda's president, whose name is Habyarimana, who was a Hutu, wasn't always super anti-Tutsi, but he flipped his shit when Kagame invaded. He ignited a toxic wave of something called Hutu power, belching racist propaganda like he had a blue check on Twitter or something. Soon, Hutu power wasn't just an idea, it was an entire political ideology, a force that was on steroids. To disguise deeper issues of political and social conflict as ethnic tension, the government decided to start fabricating stories about Tutsi-created crises. Even among Hutus, there existed division between moderates and hardliners, which culminated in power struggles within political parties. Hardliners started to train youth militias, groups like the Interahamwe, to start preparing for a systematic elimination of the Tutsis. The army of Rwanda even assisted, and at one point even the French were helping out because they weren't really aware of what the plan was. So given that they were doing that, were the horrors of the Rwandan genocide premeditated? Well, courts to this day can't really decide. But know this, it spun into a web of ethnic tension, political maneuvering, and a cocktail of deadly propaganda. Starting in 1990, the Rwandan army started to hand out machetes to civilians, supposedly for civil defense, because they were fighting against the RPF, which before the peace treaty was a rebel group. But guess what? Those same machetes became the implements used in the Rwandan genocide. Militias, these youth groups I mentioned earlier, basically served as support for the army and the police when it came to the mass killings. These militias had around 50,000 members, and most of them were recruited from those who had been internally displaced from the fighting with the RPF. By 1993, the hardliners were starting to make lists of traitors to kill. A new radio station showed up called Radio Télévision Libre de la Mille Collines, or RTLM, and it started getting popular, playing pop music, and started to casually pump out anti-Tutsi hate speech. We'll circle back to this. It got the nickname Radio Machete. Also, in 1993, Burundi's first Hutu president got assassinated by Tutsi extremist military officers, causing chaos and reinforcing Hutu fears about the Tutsis. This event supercharged the hardliners' push for what I would argue was a planned genocide. In January of 1994, a UN general named Romeo Dallaire sent a fax warning that there was the potential of a genocide, and was told to back off. Despite all of this, the courts still have yet to prove, though, that the genocide was a premeditated conspiracy. But you know what? It's kind of not super important because really it didn't change the tragic outcome. On April 6, 1994, President Habyarimana's plane got shot down, killing everyone on board. Who did it is still debated to this day. Some investigations blame Paul Kagame, the current president of Rwanda, but other investigations blame Hutu extremists in the military. Who did the assassination, though, is not really as important, though, because regardless, this event is what kickstarted the genocide. To try and stop the carnage to come, a group of Belgian soldiers working at the UN mission in Rwanda tried to escort the Rwandan prime minister to the public radio station to make a national address trying to, calm everybody down. However, the president's personal guard took over the radio station. A mass of soldiers outside the station, along with some civilians, overwhelmed the escort and killed the prime minister, and they also captured the Belgian soldiers, who were later tortured then killed. The night between the 6th and 7th of April, groups of extremists went around the capital of Kigali with a list of moderates and journalists with a plan to kill them all. Only a few of them actually survived. By the next day, political opposition and journalists who might have reported on the situation were either dead or fleeing. What followed over the next 100 days is one of the greatest horrors of human history. The Rwandan government weaponized those ID cards to identify who was Tutsi and made them easy targets. While the RPF rebel forces resisted, organizations like the UN sat very firmly on their hands. Theoneste Bagosora was the man who orchestrated the genocide, the president who took over after the president had been assassinated. He manipulated everyday people that the RPF had killed the president with no proof and coerced them to carry out the murders. We like to think that this horror erupted suddenly, but it's actually a myth. The violence was complicated and messy, and some places it was slower and faster and very local. The world could have intervened in many different points, and it's very convenient to portray it as a big conflagration that they couldn't have responded to in time. In Kigali, elite troops and militias set up roadblocks, identified who was Tutsi using those ID cards, and used it to slaughter them. Local governments orchestrated the carnage in rural areas where neighbors turned on neighbors. In the chaos, Bagosora set up a puppet government, but he was still really the only man in charge. Over 100 days, groups like the Presidential Guard butchered Tutsis. Their goal was to eradicate all Tutsis in Rwanda. The Kagera River was so saturated with bodies that the neighboring Ugandan fishing industry was damaged because of it.
The announcements over the radio were becoming increasingly alarming. It was really scary to hear how Tutsis were being killed in some areas of Rwanda. We were told we would be killed. It became risky staying at home as people were being killed in their own homes and in the streets. So my family and I, as many other Tutsi families, were forced to run away from home and hide. I still remember how scared my parents were. But as children, my siblings and I thought the mayhem would stop soon, but that was not the case. We spent 3 months hiding in many different places, and during this period, many of my family members were murdered, including my father, my 3 brothers, my grandparents, my uncles, and many friends. My father was the first person to be killed, followed by my brothers. So my mother, my sisters, and I kept hiding without knowing whether we were going to survive or not. I also remember hearing the people who took my father talking about how happy they were to have killed him. It was one of the worst times in my life. I wish they had killed me too.
The RPF eventually pushed back, slowing down the killing spree. In late June, French-led UN forces descended, trying to provide humanitarian aid. The killers, though, just seized this as an opportunity and attacked Tutsis as they left hiding, seeking refuge. But finally, in July, the RPF captured control of the government and put an end to the massacre. Kind of. Violence still spilled over for years and years after it was over. And also, guess what? Many of the culprits, including the important people in the Rwandan government, escaped to neighboring Zaire, which at the time was what was Congo. So how many were lost? The numbers are kind of gut-wrenching. Somewhere between 500,000 and over 1 million people died. But death wasn't the only horror. Countless orphans, countless shattered lives. That number represents 70% of Rwanda's Tutsi population, wiped out. The genocide was, in many ways, successful. If you were Tutsi, odds are you ended up dead, not alive. And the ripple effect spilled over into neighboring countries, causing violence and chaos for decades. Who wielded these machetes, though? It was people's neighbors, local militias. Some even used bulldozers to raze churches that were sheltering people. And that's not even to talk about rape, a weapon of war, a tool of dehumanization. Both Tutsi and moderate Hutu women were targeted by it. Up to 500,000 women, 500,000. Rape campaigns inflicted many survivors with HIV. And that's not even talking about the Twa. 10,000 of them were killed. That's 30% of the entire population. And they're often overlooked, sometimes called the forgotten victims of the Rwandan genocide. Now you might be asking, how did this madness spread like wildfire? How did neighbors turn on neighbors? Let's talk about RTLM, Radio Télévision Libre de Mille Collines. This wasn't just any radio station. It was the soundtrack to the slaughter. Let's delve into how the airwaves served as the arteries of genocide, pumping hate and propaganda into the heart of Rwanda. It's a chilling example of media turned monstrous. Let's descend deep into the dark power of radio propaganda, specifically RTLM, during the Rwandan Genocide, igniting violence across villages and turbocharging the horrors committed. Actually, don't imagine. Here are some clips.
Avis à tous les Guinéens qui nous écoutent, oui, à tous les Guinéens qui nous écoutent, le Rwanda appartient à ceux qui le défendent vraiment. Et vous, les Guinéens, vous n'êtes pas des Rwandais.
abatwumva ko nyine abantu bose bahagurukiye kurwanya inyenzi n'ababwiye abasirikare bacu nibo ba mbere babwira urubyiruko rwagutse kugira ngo bafashe abasirikare bacu babwira inkumi babwira abasore murabyumva rero inyenzi ntabwo zishobora gukandira abantu bose.
There were two big players in the radio scene before the genocide, RTLM and Radio Rwanda. But RTLM was the big hit, and it was constantly vomiting out anti-Tutsi propaganda. It was government supported and loved by the president himself, and became the voice of the Hutu power regime, especially after April 6th. Meanwhile, Radio Rwanda went silent, only broadcasting classical music after the president was assassinated. So how potent was it? Did radio work as a way to spread violence? Well, one 2014 study is pretty damning. If a village had full radio coverage, violence soared by 62 to 69%. Even a small bump in coverage culminated in a 12 to 13 surge in overall violence and a 13 to 14% leap in militia-led brutality. And not just in isolated villages. This malice was contagious, with spillover proliferating like a wildfire into neighboring areas. And here's the gut punch. RTLM's propaganda was responsible overall for 10%, roughly, of all the violence of the genocide, nearly a third inflicted by armed groups. It's a brutal testament to the lethal power of mass media. Debates about shutting down RTLM at the time occurred, but were stalled over concerns about free speech. The result was an unspeakable human cost. So what's the lesson? Media, especially when spewing hate, isn't just dangerous, it's deadly. It makes you wonder, what's the price of free speech when it costs this many lives? In an era where we idealize free speech, let's not overlook its potential to unleash unspeakable atrocities. Let's not mince words. The tale of RTLM is a harsh wake-up call. The station didn't just play music, it composed a symphony of destruction. By allowing hate speech to ring out unchallenged, society becomes an enabler of atrocity. And here's the chilling part. This isn't just about Rwanda. It's a global pattern. So what happens when that hate speech starts gushing from the fringes into mainstream discourse? How does it lower the bar for violence against marginalized communities? Well, steel yourselves, because that's the can of worms we're cracking open right now. Hate speech isn't just offensive words, it's the dry underbrush that accelerates a wildfire of atrocities. Let's go to the first famous genocide example. Remember the Nazis? The World War II ones, not the Twitter ones? One of the first things they did after seizing power was to weaponize the media to propagate lies and stereotypes. That work laid the foundation for the Holocaust, rendering the slaughter of millions seem acceptable, or at least not enough to put yourself in danger over. And it wasn't just Jews, disabled people, LGBTQI+ people, Roma people, and communists, they all were in the crosshairs. Jumping forward to the 1970s, Pol Pot wielded hate speech to rally his Khmer Rouge. They called intellectuals, critics of the government, and minority groups the enemy, making it easier to turn people against them. It stoked a paranoia that culminated in nearly 2 million dead Cambodians. In the Bosnian War, Serbian media vilified Muslims, culminating in massacres like Srebrenica. Over 100,000 perished, 20,000 went missing, and all, if not started, accelerated by this hate speech campaign. And let's not neglect modern cases. The Rohingya Muslims were demonized so effectively in Myanmar that over 725,000 people had to escape to Bangladesh by 2018. One UN report asserts that the government and extremist Buddhist religious leaders were amplifying hate, which resulted in terrible crimes like murder, rape, and forcing people out of their homes, usually by setting them on fire. This hate campaign unfolded largely unchecked on Facebook, which had expanded to Myanmar but neglected to employ any content moderators who spoke Burmese. How does hate fuel these horrors? First, it dehumanizes. It depicts victims as enemies or vermin. It erodes away at our empathy. You can witness this in the way bathing in a fetid swamp of hateful jokes radicalized a whole generation of 4chan teens and turn them into the foot soldiers of the far right. It also cultivates a sickening camaraderie among hate groups, validating their prejudices and providing them a sense of community. If you're prejudiced against a group of people, you'll feel very legitimized by consuming media that reassures you you're right and that you're not alone in those beliefs. It's why your Tim's Pool, Sargons of Akkad, and Alex's Jones received so much attention despite the fact that they are regurgitating many of the same handfuls of talking points over and over and over again. It's not about actually making new points, but selling an image of a cohesive community of those who want the other dead. It's a poison that polarizes societies. The less you engage with the other, the easier it becomes to not see them as fully human. Hate speech also hawks lies to fabricate a pseudo-intellectual framework to rationalize hatred, like the false theories of racial supremacy. I mean, just jump, I don't know why I'm on this all the time, but just jump on X and see how Elon's checkmark friends are all attempting to intellectualize their base hatreds. Oh hey, completely unrelated, I'm stepback.nebula.tv on Blue Sky. I really hope it catches on. Finally, it ratchets up tension, stoking fears that the targeted groups are a direct threat to your way of life, paving the way for violent actions. It propels a narrative that they are planning to come after you, or your kids, or your women, or whatever thing that they're after. They might try to portray the group as, I'm just gonna go out and pick a random example, groomers trying to normalize the sexual exploitation of children or some bullshit like that. This not only makes preemptive violence seem justified, but intensifies the heat and pressure, like this room that's very hot right now, leading to acts of stochastic terrorism. As we near 30 years since the Rwandan Genocide, not much really has changed. Hate speech still runs rampant. And since I'm not a debate streamer, I aim to go beyond semantics and dictionary definitions, so let's define terms. All right, let's delve into the messy world of hate speech, a concept that's as slippery as it is dangerous. The United Nations probably has the best definition, I'm just gonna use that. It's any communication that uses discriminatory language based on who someone is. Race, religion, nationality, you get the idea. But let's make it real. Depending on where you live, hate speech can either get you in serious trouble or just a slap on the wrist. Now, being Canadian, I can tell you we've had a mix when it comes to hate speech laws. We have both federal and provincial versions of them. The federal law is kind of murky on what hatred actually is, but if you are convicted of violating it, you face some pretty serious fines or even jail time. On the provincial side, some provinces like Alberta and others have their own hate speech rules that are typically settled in civil court, and they've gone to the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court has pretty much said, hey, it restricts free speech, but it's all right because it's in line with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is our version of the Constitution. In Canada, experts are torn about how effective hate speech laws actually are. Some contend that they're very limited and hardly ever enforced because only a handful of hate speech cases have ever actually turned into a real sentence. Don't let Jordan Peterson's nonsense fool you about that. I've also discovered that they have been somewhat decent at keeping the far-right extremism in check. Kinda. Unlike our southern neighbor, you can't just go and purchase hate propaganda here, for example. Well, you can't just go and buy a book of the Turner Diaries or David Icke's works in this country legally, and even if imperfect, we have seen that these kind of efforts, like in internet spaces, that deplatforming hate off of the largest and most accessible platforms does perform well in curbing hate. So, how did we get here? globally with hate speech laws. After World War II, the US toyed with restricting hate speech, but they altered their focus to focus on individual rights. Germany, scarred by its recent past, came down hard on hate speech to prevent future atrocities. And don't forget big tech. Facebook, Google. They're now trying to regulate the hate speech on their platform, especially if they want to operate in the European Union, where there's probably the most strong hate speech laws, because we live in neoliberal hell, and if we want to protect marginalized people, we need to appeal to corporations. So why does this matter? Because definitions matter, laws matter, and most importantly, the lives at stake matter. Hate speech isn't just words, as I say over and over again. It's a weapon, often exploited by the powerful to fragment us. It's about time we dissect it, scrutinize it, and dethrone its damaging reign. So now that we've cracked open the can of worms that is hate speech, you might be thinking, or more likely furiously commenting, what about my freedom of speech? That's a loaded question. Let's pull back the curtain on the so-called freedom of speech. Spoiler alert, it's not as free as you think, and it's certainly not an excuse to harm others. Let's dissect the fine print of this often misunderstood freedom. I'm sure it's safe to say that not everyone is on board with censoring hate speech. If you want proof, just peruse my comment section telling me to shut up in the name of free speech. If they're feeling really spicy, they may even try to get my video flagged. Some contend that censoring hate puts restrictions on free speech and might even backfire against the people it's trying to protect. I get it. Trusting the state to protect the marginalized is risky and has quite a fraught history. But let's be honest, when we debate free speech or its censorship, we're often stuck interpreting it through an American lens. Over half my audience is American. And let me tell you, that lens, it's kind of warped. Let's expose the myth of the United States with its absolute free speech. It doesn't really hold up under scrutiny. It's not a one-way street, it's more like a complex intersection of freedoms. Take safety, for instance. Even the most die-hard free speech purists concede that there are some limits, like the classic fire in a crowded theater example. So why not extend that to hate speech, which we know endangers its targets? We have numbers and studies that show it. There's also the way that hate speech puts freedom of speech in contention with other people's freedom of speech. Hate speech engenders a hostile environment for the targeted group. It's literally designed to do so. In permitting it, you're taking away the freedom of expression, wherever you are, of the person targeted. It also depends on the notion that all positions, all people, speak on an even playing field when we know some classes of people command more power in a situation than others. Mostly people who look and act and think and love like me. So oftentimes, an absolutist notion of free speech means a defending of the free speech of only those who represent dominant identities. Think about college campuses. The story goes that universities suppress right-wing provocateurs like Ben Shapiro or Milo Snuffleupagus. But let's not delude ourselves. They're not being silenced. They're exploiting claims of censorship as publicity stunts, while actual left-wing voices are systematically stifled because they just flat out don't get invited to the university, period. I had a speaker in my department once that spoke against wealth inequality. Nothing super radical, but still a left-wing position. The wealthy donor revoked her funding of the department, and it promptly imploded. Where were the frozen peach warriors then, friends? First of all, these speakers come to a university to actively seek a megaphone for hate speech. Words crafted to dehumanize and provoke hatred of a specific identity group. A university having them speak aids in that amplification. Furthermore, the university opting to not invite them, or students protesting their stunts, serves as a perfect example of them expressing their freedom of speech. Freedom means the right to also not speak. And if the students or school don't longingly desire to give you a platform to amplify speech that hurts them and those they care about, then they shouldn't be forced to. Plus, the right manipulates these situations as publicity stunts, as I said, to earn front page op-eds in major newspapers or social media posts to accounts with millions of followers about how censored they are. The American view of free speech is, frankly, naive. Speech isn't just this sacred thing to uphold blindly. It bears weight and consequences. If you don't grasp that, you're living in a fantasy. So we've seen that the American notion of free speech can be dangerously short-sighted. But let's zoom out a little bit, okay? This isn't just an American problem. It's a global disaster with life or death stakes. Rwanda was a brutal lesson. 30 years have slipped by, but what have we really learned? The richest guy on the planet, for example, just shat $40 billion to force hate speech back on to a major social media platform. Today, if you invoke free speech, suddenly any meaningful dialogue on platforming and content moderation screeches to a halt, like it's some kind of magic incantation. Words kill. We've witnessed it in Rwanda and in countless other tragedies since mass media was born. Even during the pandemic, COVID conspiracies and pseudoscience went, for lack of a better term, viral, costing lives. Escalating hate speech and fake news, they're ticking time bombs. If you think that Nazis on Twitter are harmless, then I can tell you for sure you're not a Muslim, a trans person, or anyone else whose life is in more and more danger with each post. Look, in this age of giant communications platforms, we kind of need to grow up and assume responsibility. We vowed never again after Rwanda, and it's about time we honored that. Words aren't just words. They can inspire and bring out the best of our species. They can also be catalysts for chaos and conflict. After discussing the Rwandan genocide, it's hard to ignore the fact that conflicts, often accelerated by hate speech, can ripple into the present day and beyond. This isn't just about the past. It's about understanding the complex web of modern conflicts that are still playing out right now, not only in Rwanda, but across neighboring countries. If you're like me, and you're passionate about diving deeper into these intricate stories, I have something for you. The tragedy of the Rwandan genocide and the role that words can play in fueling hatred is a somber reminder of the complex world we live in. If you're intrigued by the topics of war and conflict and desire to see the world with greater clarity, you may want to explore the series Modern Conflicts. This insightful series is brought to you by the talented team behind Real Life Lore and looks in deep at the battles and wars of the 21st century. And like how I mentioned, the Rwandan genocide is behind many of the conflicts ongoing right now, not only in Rwanda, but in neighboring countries, you can see these conflicts as the modern incarnation of decades, centuries even, of tensions and struggles. If you like Step Back, you're gonna like this series. And Modern Conflicts is a Nebula original series. But Nebula isn't just another streaming service. It's a platform owned by its creators, allowing us to delve into subjects that often get demonetized on YouTube, like, say, a video discussing free speech in the Rwandan genocide. Without Nebula, important subjects like this one wouldn't even be possible for me to tackle while still being able to pay the bills. Plus, with a Nebula membership, you get access to classes like high-spec content on a low-spec budget by Alex the Low-Spec Gamer. Perfect for those like me who know the value of working on a tight budget because looking at my bank account right now fills me with terror. And right at this moment, we're doing something a little special. For the month of September, we're offering lifetime memberships for Nebula. At $300, you pay once and get access for as long as both you and Nebula exist. Lifetime memberships are the best way to support the creators, help us make big Nebula originals with bigger budgets, and grow the platform. If you use my code, 1/3 of the money goes directly to supporting this channel, Step Back. Now, I'll be honest, if you're looking for the best price, the annual membership is the best way to go. With my link in the description, pinned comment, or QR code, you can get an annual plan for something like $2.50 a month. But the lifetime membership, that's about standing with us and enabling even bigger projects. Whether you've signed up recently or through a bundle using a creator code, we've got you covered. If you signed up in the last 30 days with a regular plan, the cost of lifetime is prorated. And if the lifetime membership feels too rich for your blood, which I very much understand, no worries. There are other options available, like the 40% discounted annual plan. Did I mention that it's $2.50 a month? Just use the link in the description or the pinned comment and you'll directly support my work, all while accessing a world of knowledge on Nebula. Thank you for standing with creators like me who strive to bring truth and reflection into our lives. Today, though, we've just scratched the surface of a dark tale, answering the harrowing question, can words kill? With a resounding yes. But what sparked that fuse in Rwanda? How did hate infect communities, turning friends into enemies? The story's deeper and it's more than academic. It's our moral duty to unearth it. My last Rwanda video that I made back in 2018, that this is sort of an update to, dissects the web of ethnic strife and political games that triggered Rwanda's 100-day nightmare. It's not just history, it's a warning, a call to action for us here and now. Ignorance isn't an option when lives dangle in the balance. So click on one of these things and join me on this urgent journey through a past that still resonates today. Let's arm ourselves with knowledge and crush the seeds of hate before they sprout. The path prevention lies in knowledge, reflection, and responsibility. Let's take that path together. Oh, and remember to sign up for Nebula.